That's a new voice.
I know.
Recording in progress. But we are recording. Hello. Move this out of the way here. Hello to everybody. Welcome to History Matters and Soda's Coffee. I'm going to explain this after the discussion today. And hopefully, Elizabeth is out there. Okay, so today I really kind of agonized a little bit over what to talk about today. I had several ideas and then I settled on one that allows me to rope several in that I was thinking about. And I called it Attacking Democracy. But what I really want to talk about is how do you deliberately dismantle democracy, right? It doesn't just sort of collapse. So, what are some of the things you can do? That's what I want to talk about today, um, particularly because in this past 10 days or so, every pundit and commentator appears to have finally realized that democracy is in danger. So I want to talk about that and why that is. But before I do that, I must turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
Hello, everybody. And our rules of the game are as follows. We encourage you to use chat to have conversations, both germane to the conversation and occasionally not, as long as it remains family friendly. And we just ask that you, of course, try to contribute to our community here today. If you do have questions, we ask that you put them in Q&A, and that's where we'll take questions. A lot easier to keep track of questions and who's asked them and help sort of shape our conversation through the Q&A questions. So please do that. And as always, if you don't, poor Joanne will have to sit through my questions, which is just
The
not fair to
non-threat,
anybody
completely,
whatsoever. But
completely non-threat.
and as always, if you like what we do here at the National Council for History Education, please make sure to join us. You can join us at the web, www.ncheteach.org. Click on join to join us. Check out our content. We'll be updating this summer. Now that our website is functional and moving and everything is working the way it's supposed to be, we're going to be doing some big updates in the next few months. So watch out for new content, especially as we plan for 21-22 programming, which I can't believe we're saying out loud, but that is quickly coming up. Of course, the last thing I do want to mention is please save the date for August. Oh dear, I always do this. It's the August 3rd and 4th coming up. We have our second annual Equity Summit here at NCHE, which we will be doing virtually again. And this is an opportunity for us to talk about issues of equity and how we move forward in a post-pandemic world. So please save those dates and join us. Very nominal fee this year, but we're looking forward to giving you all some really great content. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Joanne.
Okay, excellent. I'm gonna shift this. Okay, there we go. Okay, so again, welcome to everybody. So as I said at the outset, I want to talk a little bit about how do you attack democracy, because democracies don't just tumble. I'm going to come back to that idea in a minute when I talk about thoughts about democracy and the founding. But you need to do things to dismantle democracies. That's sort of what I want to approach today. I'm going to mention a few things, by no means being comprehensive, but a few things that are worth talking about. And I did say at the outset, for those some of you who've just joined, one of the striking things about the last week to 10 days is that a lot of commentators and pundits and a variety of sorts of people writing articles and making statements in the news and wherever else. There was a petition by, I don't know, 100, 200 political scientists along the same lines. All of a sudden, people are all saying, hey, democracy is under threat. Now, those of you who have been following along, we have been doing this for over a year. And I am by no means the only person who has been yelling at the top of my lungs for over a year that, and much over a year, that democracy is under threat, that we need to pay attention to that we need to think about that that's a serious threat that's very present now. It's striking that all of a sudden everyone has decided that that's the sort of chorus that they need to join in now. It's an interesting question as to why, and we can talk a little bit about that in the discussion. My one of my guesses is actually the full impact of the fact that there will not be a commission along the lines of which there still might be one, but that there was a vote against a commission, put it that way, to investigate the events of January 6th. I wonder if perhaps the actual implications of that got through to people, meaning there was an attack on our government and no one on one side, one political side, seems to, or very few, a few people did want a commission, but many Republicans, the majority obviously, voted against even discussing having a commission to investigate that attack. That's serious. I don't know if it's being taken seriously. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but I'm wondering, and that's the first thing that came to my mind this morning when I was thinking about this topic, is maybe that fact in some ways has driven home for people the idea that something really abnormal happened and no one is declaring it abnormal. We can come back to that. The larger question, and whether there's a commission and whether something is investigated, is part of this larger pattern. I think that the not revealing enough but starting point sentence about how do you attack a democracy, well, that's to do that you attack the process, you attack processes, right? Because at its heart, any kind of democratic government, it's grounded on, in some way or another, the public and public opinion. It's representative in some way, and to accomplish all of those things, there are processes set in motion to enable those things to happen, to allow for free and fair regular elections, to give people a way to voice their desires and demands through their representatives. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which democratic governments really are grounded on process, which makes sense, right? I mean, a monarchy, not that the option today is monarchy or democracy, but in a monarchy, thinking back to the founding period, it's pretty much more simple, right? I mean, not to say that there aren't other understandings and rules and things in play, but the king is the king or the queen is the queen. And that's a pretty fundamental assumption there. To get a democratic government going and to have it be a credible democratic government, that's a trickier thing. And so in a sense, that's what the founding generation was really focused on. That's what the Constitutional Convention was really about. It's easy and obvious to say, well, the Constitutional Convention was about creating a constitution, which it was. But, and it came from a period when there were a lot of people who felt that the Articles of Confederation were too weak and there needed to be a stronger central government. All of that is true. But the convention itself and what they understood that they were doing in creating a stronger government was they were creating processes. They were creating a structured series of processes, and we have, you know, checks and balances and separation of powers are part of it, but they created a series of processes that would represent how this government would run. That's what the Constitution represented. That's what they came back to again and again and again. When people talked about the government being under threat, there would be references to the fact that, well, there's a process, right? There's a constitutional process that we put in motion that some of us more than others, right? Hamilton was very focused on getting people to really get the authority of the Constitution, but still, generally speaking, people wanted Americans to understand the Constitution as a kind of national pact that joined us together, a kind of understanding that Americans came together under as to how our government should run. And that's, you know, when they thought about democratic governments in the founding period, and we've talked about this in a variety of different ways before, they, part of why they worried about it and part of why they considered democracies and democratic government to be so vulnerable is the very fact that although it was grounded on processes, at the heart of those processes were the American people. And in a popular government of any kind, grounded on public opinion in some way, it's a vulnerable government because the people can be swayed, their opinions can be warped, they can be misled. Ambitious people tend to do that. In this period we're talking about right now, ambitious men for the most part were the ones who would do that to raise themselves to power, and then whatever form of democratic government was in play would topple. So that's what they assumed was the big threat, right? That a democracy or a democratic government is grounded on the people, but that makes it, on the one hand, different and unique and representative and vulnerable. And so they looked back in history. I've talked before about how the founding generation saw history as kind of a big grab bag of lessons, universal lessons about history and government and humankind. And they looked back all across time and decided that it was very obvious that this was a fragile form of government. And so, really, there needed to be a lot of attention paid to processes and heeding processes. And if something didn't work, and I know I've quoted this before at some point when I was talking about the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson is asked not that long after the election, which was a really fraught election, what would you have done if everything had sort of blown up? What would you have done if people had tried to seize the government, or if Americans had marched with guns, or what would you have done? What would we have done? And Jefferson, and this is going to be a bad paraphrase, but in one way or another says, well, we would have, gone back to the Constitution, had a convention and tweaked what was there, and then just keep going, right? So processes were at the core of what was going on. There's a reason why the metaphor that people like to use a lot. I don't know if it's the most common one, but it could be. I'm being a historian by not stepping forward and saying that, but I think it is. A metaphor that you see again and again and again is discussion of the government as, quote, a machine in motion, right? Like Hamilton at one point says, we need to put the machine in motion. That's the kind of metaphor. Granted, it's also like the Enlightenment age, and people are interested in science and everything else, so that is of that moment. But more than that, that's the assumption, is that it's machine, a collection of processes, and it needs to be put in motion. Okay, so democracies are vulnerable, democracies are fragile. The founding era looked back and saw that fact and worried that it wouldn't be a form of government that could survive in the modern world, and that it would collapse. And we've talked any number of times about the immediacy of that fear for that generation, that if they did one stupid thing, or they did something wrong, it could start a sort of cavalcade of disaster that could end the republic. However, thinking in a slightly less immediate way, this brings us back to the larger question that we started with, which is, so how do democratic governments collapse, particularly given that there are constitutional processes that are meant to be there for moments of crisis, that you can turn to them to figure a way out of a moment of crisis. So, you can turn to the Supreme Court, you can turn to your representatives in Congress and have them try and figure out solutions. There are any number of ways in which you're supposed to be able to turn to the government at moments of crisis. So if they don't just collapse, how do you dismantle democracies? Some of it is dismantling. I think more than that, it's discrediting processes that really chips away, erodes the power of a democracy. Discrediting those processes, discrediting, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and I'm going to start with voting, but that's an obvious one, right? Discrediting the whole electoral process, discrediting voting, and the fact that elections actually can declare in a fair way winners and losers. Acting as though there was a vast problem of fraudulent voting in the last election to further discredit the electoral process. You discredit things so that people step back from process and say, well, I can't trust that. So then what? And in the place of process, it's easy for people to substitute blunt power, an ambitious leader, hatred, fear, all of the things that people grab at when they feel that there is no process in place, although there is one. So I want to talk a little bit about this. How do you dismantle? How do you defeat a democracy? And I think a lot of that is about discrediting. It's interestingly, I want to say it's psychological. There's a psychological component to it, because a democracy is grounded on faith in the system. more than anything else. And if you don't have that faith in the system, ultimately a democracy is going to be in trouble. And so if you chip away at that faith, if you make people not believe in the system, that's a really good first step towards making it vulnerable and being able to dismantle it. So voting is indeed where I wanted to start. Obviously, there's a long history of suppressing votes in American history. As I just said, right now the name of the game is, oh no, we're just stopping fraud. Fraud that really didn't happen on a massive scale, that wasn't found out, even though it was investigated multiple times. No one has been able to prove it. Multiple court cases came up and went down because there wasn't evidence of fraud. But still, if you hammer home the idea again and again and again that elections are flawed, that they should be able to be overturned because they're so readily flawed, and I'm going to come back to this idea, but also that the other side are, that's all they're about is fraudulent claims. So you need to defeat them to also protect the whatever system it is you're trying to protect, which clearly isn't built on fair elections as we understand them. So there's a long history of suppressing votes. That's obviously the core of a democratic system of government, is the people deciding themselves who gets power to the degree that they can under the Constitution. And your ability to do that is fundamental to your rights as a citizen. If you are being denied that right, or if it's being made so difficult for you to have that right that in essence you're being pushed out of the way, that's a really fundamental smack at democracy. And we're watching that right now in a variety of different states, all kinds of rules coming up. Some of them, it's unclear, even if there were fraud, widespread fraud, which there wasn't, even if there were, what some of these regulations have to do with that is a matter of question. So what we're watching is people questioning and thereby weakening assumptions about the electoral process, and people othering people who somehow or other their votes don't count or shouldn't count. And in some cases, that's a question of race. And in some cases, that's a question of belief. I'm going to come back to this idea about Democrats not being American. I'm going to come back to that shortly. But so fundamental place to start, Americans know that, they've done it over time, suppressing in one way or another the vote, and in doing so, drawing lines in the sand about who is American, who counts, and who doesn't. Part of that, and related to that, but a different point, another way that you can smack at a democracy is to normalize the abnormal. Some of that, again, is done with simple repetition, or a lack of response to something that demands an enormous response. Here we come back to a commission on the events of January 6th, right? That, what happened that day, no matter how many people say it was nothing and it was like a group of tourists, which is nonsense, what happened that day is that there was an attack on the government, and in process, an attempt to stop the wheels of government and seemingly to harm people who are in the process of having that government go forward. That's really serious. If that happens and you don't think it's worth investigating, and you declare to the public that, well, you know, those Democrats are doing it for partisan reasons, but really, what else do we need to know? Think about the degree to which that simple statement is kind of normalizing what happened. It wasn't so bad. We know what we need to know. Let's just go on. That's a big problem. That's a huge statement. And I think people thinking in a logistical, pragmatic way, you know, like, well, what could a commission do anyway? You know, what'll they find out that we don't know? Well, there are things to find out that we don't know. But above and beyond that fact, having a commission represents a statement that seemingly something happened that was wrong, that needs to be investigated. A commission represents a kind of line in the sand. And the declaration that we don't need one, that's a real smack, again, at processes, right? In a sense, having an investigative commission represents a process of dealing with a crisis. And what we're being told by some people is, oh, we don't need that process. Let's just keep going. That's a problem. And that's something that Heather and I are going to talk about in the next episode of our podcast now and then is commissions and why they matter. Also, how else do you smack at and discredit democracies? This is an obvious one, but it's worth stating anyway. Propaganda, we've talked about that a lot of times, aimed at suppression and fear, right? The double whammy, aimed at suppressing, silencing, intimidating people, and brewing fear, both in people who want to say or do certain things and in people who don't want others to say or do those things. Propaganda, again, psychological isn't quite the right term, but if you think about everything that I'm talking about here in one way or another, it has to do with how people conceive of government, of how they understand its workings, and of how much faith and trust they're willing to put in it. Now, propaganda can destroy faith or can shape really powerful, really damaging opinions. We've talked before how in early America there were a lot of words. At some point in my first book, Affairs of Honor, I talk about, and I meant to look it up before now and I didn't, but I string them together. People would refer to, like, mono aristocratic, federalist, king loving, British loving, there would be these lines, these strings of words that would get pulled together, and each side did it about the other. Sort of buzzwords that just represented they are bad, they are anti-American in one way or another. Aristocrat, there's a statement I think I've used before, or paraphrased probably before, in which there's a Federalist complaining in the late 1790s that the word aristocrat, you can't say the word aristocrat at all, and that no one should be allowed to say the word aristocrat if there's a public rally or something, because as soon as someone says aristocrat, you're done as a Federalist. That's it, because along with the word aristocrat goes lots of baggage about elite rule and monarchy and suppressing the people. And, in a sense, that's an example of a word that does link with things that people would have been worried about in the late 1790s, but it gains this sort of propagandist weight. An example of that I just wanted to talk about briefly today, because it's gaining steam in some ways, or at least in the news it is critical race theory. I'm not going to go into great detail about what critical race theory is, but I am going to talk very briefly about it because it's being used right now as a vacuous propagandist kind of buzzword. It's essentially being used, and we're seeing it in various school districts and in a variety of different ways. It's being used to discourage talk of racism, to intimidate people who want to talk about such subjects into silence. It's being made to be many things that it really isn't. And that's what I wanted to talk about, was exactly what is it? Because it's being used just right now as propaganda, meaning essentially, let's not talk about race. I mean, that's what it boils down to. I don't want any of that divisive, racist stuff in my school. I don't want people to talk about racism. If you look at where we are and you look at the fundamental questions of race and racism that we have to grapple with as a country to enable ourselves to be a diverse and more democratic nation, declaring that you shouldn't talk about race or racism is a remarkable statement. And as someone, I don't remember who now, someone said this, it might be one of my colleagues at Yale. Someone on Twitter said it, focusing on critical race theory is a remarkable way to say that race doesn't matter for people. If your argument is we don't need to focus on race, but all you're doing is talking about critical race theory, that's a problem. But I want to talk about what it actually is for just a moment, because it has no meaning the way it's being used now. And the word theory is scary to some people. The word critical, actually all three words critical, right, to many people that's just like that's guilt. That's assigning guilt. That's bad. Race, to some people, it's just bad to discuss that at all. In theory, sounds like some scary elitist thing that, the left is imposing on everybody else. So let's talk for a minute about what it actually is, so that we can recognize the degree to which it's just being deployed as an empty statement to stop people from focusing so much on race, which is essentially what people are doing. Critical race theory actually began in legal studies. That's where its origin was. And it's fundamentally about how racism is built into our legal system and other institutions of society, and that needs to be reckoned with. Now, think about that. Racism is built into our legal system. Think about denying that fundamental fact. We see it all the time, right? I mean, that's hardly controversial. That's the fundamental thing at the essence of critical race theory. And I'm quoting, this is actually from the American Bar Association. It says, critical race theory is not a diversity and inclusion training, but a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society. And it's an idea that emerged in the legal academy and spread to other fields of scholarship. It acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. I'm going to repeat that. Critical race theory acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. That is not a controversial statement. It isn't, right? I mean, and I'm not saying that as a liberal or a Democrat or anything else. Racism is built into our system, and we need to deal with that. That to me is just not controversial. But people using that phrase, they're acting as though it's some weird indoctrination that says that all white people are guilty and that's what it teaches. Any focus on guilt is actually imposed by people who think about racism and feel guilty, because guilt is not a fundamental part of critical race theory. It might be the impact of you actually thinking about racism. I don't know. That's up to you. But that's not what it's about. It's a way of looking at racism in the law and in society, and ideally finding ways to improve matters. There's a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw who was fundamental to this in its beginnings. By some accounts, she actually came up with critical race theory, the phrase. And I actually went to some of her work too, to look and see what she said. She acknowledges that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people because it's grown over the years. But fundamentally, it asks questions like this: how has the law protected racism and upheld racial hierarchies? How does the law reproduce racial inequality? How can the law be used to dismantle racism and racial inequality? Okay, again, think of all the claims being made about what it is. Those are just not controversial statements. Racism is built into things. Let's make it better. Obviously, it means much more than that, but that's the heart of what this is. Now, I've said this before. I'm going to stop in a minute or two. I've said this before on Twitter. I've used the phrase spaghetti meat wall because there are some people on the right who are clearly searching for some cultural something to grab at, to get traction, to get people riled up and upset enough that'll have a political influence. And we've seen all kinds of things along those lines, and most of them haven't gotten traction. Critical race theory might be getting some traction. So here's the weirdly contradictory thing I'm going to say. I mentioned it, I defined it because you just have to think about what it is and what's thereby being said. We can't talk about that. Really? That said, we shouldn't be talking about critical race theory all the time, because that's what the folks want who are talking about it all the time, right? They want to have that be a central issue that we're all talking about, rather than other fundamental things like, oh, I don't know, discouraging democracy, right? Overturning democracy. I'm pointing out use of propaganda, and in a sense, I'm also saying let's not fall into the trap of constantly using propaganda that is being handed to us by the other side. We need to have conversation. We need to respond to what's out there. But we don't want to go picking the spaghetti that's being thrown against the wall ourselves, right? We don't want to give credibility. So that's a kind of it sort of has inherent contradictions in it. But that's sort of where my mind was this morning after I wrote this out, and then I thought, I have mixed feelings about discussion of this because on the one hand, it's vitally important, the idea of racism being inherent in American society. On the other hand, using the phrase critical race theory just plays into whatever some people on the right are claiming it is. In the end, all of the things I talked about here, suppressing voting, discrediting the electoral process, normalizing the abnormal, using propaganda to declare certain things or people or ideas out of bounds. In the end, that's what they're all about, is declaring people out of bounds, not American, and thereby not worthy of having the vote, right? You can justify what you're doing as not attacking democracy at all if you brand your opponents un-American and dangerous. And that's some of what we see people attempting to do now, using those kinds of ideas to justify undercutting democracy. And we need to be aware of that fact. And I know I've been howling about this for over a year. This is, what did I say? It's the 61st episodes over 61 weeks in one way or another. It's part of why I started doing this in the first place. We need to think about what's going on around us now. We need to acknowledge the underlying purpose of it, recognize that, respond to that, and not just sort of sit back and watch it happen. I just don't know if people are putting the pieces together. And if this week represents the first time that some people said, huh, democracy is being threatened, I'm glad they realized it, but come on, folks, catch up with the message, because I don't want to end with a dire note, but I'm going to end with a dire note. We have a different administration. We have different people in power. Democracy is still under attack. And some of that's on a state level, but it's still something I'm going to worry about. It's still something I'm going to talk about. And it's still something I'm going to encourage you folks to think about too. Okay, I shall now step off my soapbox and open things up for a conversation. Let's see here. I can change this up so that I can see the person I'm talking to. Let me get chat open. I know Carolee is now saying mug.
And Tom.
Pardon? And Tom. Okay.
And Tom. Yes.
That's two. Okay. So two things I want to acknowledge. I hope I'm saying your last name right. Oguss. Ogus? Elizabeth Ogus? Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Elizabeth Ogus sent a mug cozy so that I don't have to hold a paper towel up in front of my mug. How kind is that? Now, of course, I spent before this started, I spent a lot of time worrying about a wardrobe dysfunction. Like, is it showing? But at any rate, this is quite thoughtful, and I'm very excited not to have a paper towel in my face. So thank you much to Elizabeth. Much appreciated. Okay, now wipe the darn lipstick off. The mug that I chose is this, because the key, or a key, to upholding democracy is education, and is history education. And so the NCHE, they're the ones who have it. They understand that history matters. Okay, so that is my mug for the day.
Well done.
Mike says, where can you get that? You can get the mug. There is a shop on the NCHE.
We have a shop.
There's a shop that has this mug and has a newbie mug and a variety of other cool things. So, okay, now we have had the mug reveal. Matt.
So again, easy one this week, because as I said earlier, I'm still feeling slightly guilty about throwing Kitty Kelly at you a few weeks ago. So I went with a relatively simple one. Of course, this is the White House. This is the Situation Room. This is the main conference room of the Situation Complex, if you will. And obviously, I went with this because when our topic is threats to democracy, and when there is a threat to democracy, is there a better room to have
It's a situation
as the center of communications for that. So
Excellent.
that's why I went with that this week.
Excellent. Education and dealing with the situation. It's a good pairing.
I think it's a great pairing.
Yeah.
Okay. Dave, what is the role of the media in illustrating, informing, or educating the public? There is an attack on democracy during the founding, before the Civil War, and now. So, what is the role of the media in informing the public that there's an attack on democracy during the founding, the Civil War, and now?
Right. Well, so complicated question. Uh, there's the question of what the media could or should be doing and what the media does, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but for the most part, the press has always been partisan in one way or another, and there have been standards of being impartial that came into play over time. Um, so in the founding era, newspapers were, for the most part, party organs were tied to commerce and trade. So there might be some that were claiming monarchy is coming, but that would have been tied to an anti-federalist message. In the Civil War era, again, newspapers, and actually my last book talks about this a lot, the ways in which stories being published, or candidates like Franklin Pierce being talked about in the North and being talked about in the South by the same party. He's like two different candidates, because what they're aiming at is political benefit. Today it's a little bit more complicated, partly because there are so many different ways in which we can be informed by things, not just through the press, but actually above and beyond the press, by each other. I think it's important for investigative journalism grounded in actual fact to be out there. I think it's important for people to be able to step up and talk about what they see as a crisis. That means, of course, some people will step up and say democracy is in crisis, and some people will step up and say we're in crisis because Democrats are socialists, or whatever the message is. I do think the media has a responsibility now, partly because there are some people who I honestly think are willing to surrender aspects of democracy to maintain power, and that's scary. So in this moment, I think there need to be some people who are saying that. I think there need to be people offering facts. What is democracy? What are some definitions? How does it work? Why is something threatening? What is the history of a thing that is happening now that's not just some, like, oh, look at that, they're focusing on voter fraud that didn't happen. It's like, no, let's look at the deep roots and what that meant and what it was meant to do. So that's a long roundabout historian way of saying media does have a role, particularly now, given that there is a frontal attack on democracy. But it's complicated because people are going to step forward and say what they want to say, and some of it'll be on one side and some of it'll be on another side, and then it's left to the public to think about evaluating what they're reading. And some of us do that and some of us don't do that, and that's also always been true. So in some ways it's the problem inherent in the importance of journalism. It's really important, and for that reason it's really complicated, and people use it to really good and bad effect. Gosh, you guys are going.
I gotta tell you that they're killing it with the questions this week. So
Wow.
I'll do my best to try to get through as many as we can. This is wonderful, wonderful questions. So couple that are related directly to sort of the foundational period in America. The first from Catherine. Catherine, says Joanne, you were talking about the what the Constitutional Convention was for, and that they were creating a process. She wants to know, was it a reaction to the fact that Britain has no written constitution that they were codifying it in that way, or was that part of it?
It's a good question. I would say I don't think that was like a direct reason. I think the main reason was many people thought the government needed to be stronger, and they needed to do something that went beyond the articles. And the articles, I mean, they're relatively brief for what they are. It was understood that whatever was going to be created needed to be in writing and stronger than that. I will say, and this has always been interesting to me, and I have never um, studied it in any way. I have there's a grad student who I was doing an independent study with last semester, and he's interested in this fact. Think about the fact that colonies, all of the colonies that created ultimately the United States, colonies are created with charters and written documents that clearly define sort of what they are and how they were founded. And in that sense, colonies have a sort of paper-based um, leaning, right? That a colony by definition is founded by pieces of paper, constitutions, agreements, negotiations. And I've always wondered if part of the American sort of, what do I want to say, habit or need for things to be actually in writing is partly based on the fact that they were raised as loyal British subjects, but as loyal British subjects, they had these very direct negotiated pieces of paper that told them what their government was, and they had a small enough and immediate enough, intimate enough government that they knew the people in power and felt that they had a right to weigh in. So I don't know if the colonial mindset, meaning if you're a colonist sort of and grounded, a colony grounded on that kind of parchment agreement, whether that shaped people's understandings of what constitutions should be. But it's a really interesting question that I've probably come up with more than once in more than one class and have never looked into. But it's an interesting one.
Melissa, sort of on that note, Melissa wants to know, what did early Americans mean by aristocrat? The word aristocrat. What are the monarchical practices that they would have been familiar with that underlie that word?
Which is a good question, and I think in the sense that I just used it, so kind of as a buzzword, it probably meant a lot of things. It would have meant an entrenched elite, people who people have privilege, right? They're born into privilege, and the old world system in which you certain people in society have certain importance and others don't, and it's not in any way malleable or flexible. It would have been tied with monarchy. Aristocrats are people who are, in a sense, they have families that have had long histories of privilege and wealth, who, in one way or another, are recognized in the, sort of monarchical structure, the aristocratic structure of British society. It would sort of mean all of those things. I think entrenched, privileged, old world elite who are out to crush democracy. I think that's probably what people took aristocrat to mean. And particularly given that, in the colonies and then in the United States, society was a lot more flexible. I mean, you could rise and fall and get land in much easier ways than you could have in the old world. And so aristocrat sort of works against that and says, yeah, you thought you thought you were going to come to the United States or come to the colonies and get land and make something of yourself and maybe move up a little in society. But no, sorry, we're still part of that entrenched system. And there are still these elite guys, these Hamiltons of the world who still want to just claim power. And, we can call them aristocrats as a shorthand for entrenched, privileged elite who can't be thrown out of office.
Dale wants to, so moving forward in time a little bit here, Dale was wondering, did Southerners in Congress in the pre-Civil War period practice chipping away at democratic processes?
Let me think about that for a minute.
I can do jazz hands while you do that.
Thank you for the jazz hands. I'm going to keep that one, Matt. I'm going to come back to that. Well, the short answer to that is yes. And one of the ways in which they did it on a high level, add jazz hands to bingo. One of the ways in which Southerners did that on a high level was in routinely disrupting the working of Congress and breaking the rules and getting away with it for their own benefit, to shut up Northerners, to shut up anyone who was against slavery. It became a norm. People allowed it to happen for a variety of different reasons. That was definitely slapping away at the process, and that continued for a good long time. Partly because parties included Northerners and Southerners, and when that kind of behavior helped one party over another, you had Northerners and Southerners who were agreeing that it should happen. It gets complicated when the sectional crisis really becomes sectional and the parties start to sort of erode. But yeah, in that way, on a high level, for sure. We talked last week about, I think it was last week, time has no meaning anymore. I think we talked about insurrection last week, did we not?
Yes.
And about, attacking systems of government to sort of step forward and represent the fact that you feel entitled to something that you're not getting. That obviously has a long tradition in American history too, for some of the reasons that I've already articulated in the questions this morning.
So Becky asks a really good question, and I'm going to read her question, but then I'm going to frame it in terms of the past, because I think it's germane to conversations about the founding. Her question is, do you think that the weakening of the US is feeding the increase in authoritarian governmental leaders elsewhere? How much of the world's consideration of democracy has been changed by the last administration's interest in other oligarchs? And so maybe a good way to start this question is in our founding period, when we were starting a federal government for really which was at the time a unique thing, what was the response from authoritarian government leaders? I mean, besides King George III, obviously, but what was the response from other authority? And then maybe we can get to Becky's question, because I think a little historical context would be really helpful here.
Sure. Well, I mean, so there were sort of the like France and England and Spain, like their response to what was going on in ultimately the United States was kind of mixed. So some people in France were just because also they were on the cusp of their own revolution, they were just intrigued. There are actually books. I can't call the name of them to mind, but there's a number of them, and they're all in the same section of the library, which I used to go to in the Yale Library when I could do that, on French responses to the sort of founding period and what they were thinking. And they were intrigued. They thought it was experimental along the lines of what I talked about. They didn't know if it was going to work, but they thought it was interesting. There were others who just thought it was pointless and worthless, and also even some in France who thought it would be very easy to just sweep in and take control in some way or another, which is why foreign influence is such a huge big deal. The first presidential election that was a real contest, because it's the first time Washington didn't run in 1796, is the first time Americans start to worry about foreign influence in an election, in that case, France. France wants Jefferson. They're mixing up, they're messing with the election. So part of the answer is sometimes some people didn't expect it to work and stood back and watched, and some people thought, oh, excellent, we can deploy this to our advantage, maybe get some trading advantages, use it to crush our sort of old world opponents. This will be useful. So kind of a mixed response.
So getting into Becky's question, then, do you think that are you seeing any similarities, I guess is the way to put it, between that and sort of the rise of authoritarian, the hubris of authoritarian governmental leaders elsewhere in the country or elsewhere in the world right now?
Well, the short answer is yes. And I will say that in the founding period, many Americans did think America was spreading the spark of liberty around the world, right? So that whatever was going on here, it's going to spread, and it's already spreading to France. And there was kind of the assumption underlying that kind of question that what starts in the United States will spread elsewhere. I do think that what happens in the United States influences what happens in a lot of other nations, but I also think we're in a moment when democracy is under threat. I don't want to quite say everywhere, but pretty much everywhere. And that's not entirely the fault of the United States. I think that's the moment we're in for a lot of different reasons. I think it's a supremely global moment in which what we do here does very much shape what happens with democracies elsewhere. But the reverse is true too. I think what the fate of democracies elsewhere can't help but have an impact on the survival of democracy here. So I think it's one of the big challenges of the many ones that are facing Biden as president, is that this is, I'm now repeating what my podcast said last week, but there isn't a big separation between foreign policy and domestic policy, because ultimately a huge chunk of what is being wrestled with right now is democracy, and the survival of democracy and the ways in which it can continue to work for all Americans, and what's happening in the rest of the world has an impact on that. So um, I think, I think the pandemic is a kind of blunt reminder of how global this moment is, that pandemics don't stop at borders. Pandemics go where pandemics want to go, no matter how much we pretend like, well, if we don't let a plane in, it's all going to be better. Probably not so much. Um, but it's a very global moment, and democracy is having a kind of global crisis. Um, I think it's important to recognize that. I have no way of predicting what that means, but I think it's important to recognize that.
Um, uh, so Scott asks a question, and I'm curious. I'm going to read the question. I'm curious. I want to see how you interpret this question.
Uh-oh. Okay.
It's a good question. It's a great question in a lot of ways. But I think you can kind of go different directions with it. So I'm going to allow you the freedom to do with it what you would like.
Okay.
So Scott asks, how do you reconcile predictions about the fall of democracy with contingency?
Okay.
Nice, easy one here at the
I
end.
know. No, but actually,
It's a good question.
it's a really good question, and I think the answer um, is important. Okay, so I think we are in a moment when democracy is threatened in the United States and elsewhere. I think that's a fact. The question is, what does that mean? And I've talked in other moments, other episodes about moments of extreme contingency and what that means, like the founding period when people didn't quite know what was going to happen with the government, and that made everything really fraught, and people worried about things collapsing all the time, which is true. And we all have anxieties, and we're all worried about a variety of things. That's all true. The other aspect of moments of extreme contingency that's really important to remember, because and easier to forget than the anxiety part, is that moments like this, these kinds of crisis moments, are moments when you can have positive change, right? The reason these moments of contingency, I've now said it like 100 times, are really scary is because it's honestly true. We don't know what's going to happen. And that's scary. That's not things as usual, things as normal. The process itself is under attack. We don't know. That's scary. And you know, all of us, I'm guessing, but certainly I have been in a state of anxiety for several years now, and some of it very much is related to that. But there are two sides to that. Actually, this gets right back to the first episode of History Matters that I did, in which I talked about, it was about contingency. Surprise! But the point that it ultimately made is that at moments of real extreme contingency, really bad things can happen, and that's absolutely true. And it might be tempting to live in that space, but it's not useful, because really good things can happen when there's an unknown future as well. You can make good things happen. And we're asking all kinds of questions these days and thinking about all kinds of things that have to do with the nature, the fundamental nature of American society, making it more equitable, making it more diverse, making the system more representative of the we, the people, and with the we writ really large. We're at a moment where we're having awareness, and we're asking questions that could help us move in that direction. So at the same time that the anxiety looms, and I'm right up there with the rest of you who, although I'm actually managing to sleep through the night these days. Now that I've said that, I'm jinxed it. But for a while, in the last administration, I wasn't sleeping a lot. But that said, it's so important to realize the ways in which we can have positive change, that having things unsettled means change is going to happen in one way or another, positive or negative. So let's work towards the positive and take advantage of that aspect of this moment.
I think we have time for two more quick questions. Emily asks, what type of actions would alleviate some or all of your anxiety about the future of democracy in the US?
Wait, repeat that question.
What type of actions would alleviate some or all of your anxiety over the future of democracy in the United States?
Wow.
I told you they're killing it this week.
You guys are killing it. So yeah, someone just gave a great response. Passing the Voting Right Act. Yeah. Establishing voting rights. in some kind of a powerful way. That would be good. I think seeing um, local organization and people gathering together on a local level to stand up for what they believe as far as their principles are concerned, recognizing that local government on all levels, which is what we're seeing now, can have a huge influence on whatever the nation is going to be. So organization, um, and organization represents the power to act, and it also represents awareness. So I think that would be important too. But protecting voting rights is pretty high up on my list. I think in a way that's the first thing that has to happen, because if it doesn't, if voting rights are not protected and we coast along in the way that we're going now, and they continue to get suppressed, we're going to be in big trouble. We already are. It's going to get worse. So that's kind of first and foremost. But there are a lot of things I think that would help make me feel better. That's number one.
Dave wants to know, what is the prognosis for tenure track PhD historians?
Wow, you guys are the prognosis for tenure track PhD historians. Well, right now it's not peachy, because there are humanities programs being, downsized, and colleges just in and of themselves are in economic crises because of the pandemic. There seems to be the sort of assumption that there isn't real value in the humanities, which is highly ironic given the degree in which it's really obvious that history matters and that you can't understand the present without understanding how we got here. At this particular moment, it is not a great time to start a PhD program with the assumption that you're going to get a job teaching at some kind of a college or university. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but if undergrads came to me talking about going to grad school, I would be very blunt in saying, I'm not going to say you shouldn't do it. I'm going to actually say what probably Peter Onuf said to me when I started grad school. And he was true. He was right. He said, there are going to be about 10 jobs in your field and 200 people trying to get the 10 jobs. And you're going to be one of the 10 people getting offered all the jobs or not. And so whatever you're doing in grad school, you need to be aware of the fact that getting a job at the end of this and as a professor is not guaranteed. I would say that to someone. I would say that right now, particularly, it's problematic, and education, higher education itself, is kind of in a state of flux in sometimes scary ways. I would also say that there are a lot of things you can do with a PhD. And that is also part of a conversation I would have is, first of all, do you need a PhD? Would a master's degree help? And all of the other things that we need really well-trained historians to do in American society. So kind of a more complicated answer.
That, yeah. Exactly. Yes. Okay, so it's 11 o'clock. We're about out of time. I want to throw this last one out. I know we're really short on time. I don't think it's going to take you long to
Okay.
answer this. But Gloria has asked us several questions, and she threw this last one in, and it's a good way to end today, I think.
Okay.
Gloria wants to know, is there such a thing as too much democracy? J.G. Randall said that the Confederacy died of democracy.
Wow. Well, some of the founders would tell you yes.
I was going to say.
I mean, Hamilton, I had this written down on my notes and I didn't mention it, but, I've talked before about Hamilton's last letter in which he says the biggest threat to the United States is democracy. In his mind, meaning the public having a sense that it has the power. That's a hard question to answer. Unstructured democracy, like a pure democracy, that would be a little hard to regulate. That's why, as far as the United States goes, the founders were buying into a system that was democratic, but not a pure democracy. So the short answer, I guess, is yeah, I guess it could be possible. But it would be a much longer answer for me to talk about what that would look like. But it's a really good question. And I'm glad I didn't see, normally I try to say hi to Gloria and didn't see her today. So I'm also glad I have a reason to say hello to Gloria. Okay, so we're running out of time. So let me do my spiel. Okay, so like we do every week, what we are going to do is stop recording and segue into the after party. What that means is just we're going to have a less formal, more chatty conversation about really whatever we want to talk about. If you are on Facebook and are joining us on Facebook, you will need to leave Facebook and join the link at the NCHE website to join the after party, ncheteach.org/conversations. Those of you who are here already through that link can just stick around and we will magically become the after party. Those of you who will not be partying with us in the after, thank you for coming. Thank you for humoring me in what became a much more fist clenched. I got myself very worked up this morning in writing this. I think it's important to say. So thank you, as always, for coming here, for taking part in this kind of conversation, which are the kinds of conversations which have to happen if we're going to get anywhere good from this moment. I hope you have a wonderful week. If you want more discussion of this sort of thing, I will say, look for my new podcast with Heather Cox Richardson called Now and Then, with the "and" as an ampersand, in which we pick a news related theme and talk about it together in a conversational kind of a way. It launched last week. And with that, I'm going to shut up. We're going to launch into the after party. Thank everyone for coming, and we will hopefully see you next week.
See you next week, everybody.